Welcome to the podcast today. My name is Douglas Gabriel, and I welcome you to this podcast whose topic is somewhat controversial. And as a matter of fact, it's taken me about 10 years to address this topic because it is so controversial. And that is, why is Anthroposophy, the work of Rudolf Steiner, so often connected to Buddhism? And that is a question that has some obvious answers and then some more complicated answers. But one thing happened many years ago, and I had said this, and I've seen this happen so many times in anthroposophical circles, that someone says, for instance, I'll give an example. Someone found out that myself and some friends had been initiated into masonry. And so they got completely upset that no one can be an anthroposophist and be a mason at the same time, a Freemason at the same time. Well, it finally came out that in first-class meetings that Hagen Besant and John Davies and others pointed out that Rudolf Steiner was involved in Freemasonry himself. This became a battle for decades in the Anthroposophical Society. People who said Steiner couldn't have anything to do with Freemasonry, and then others who said, well, no, right here, we have his work called the Cognitive Ritual, and it just that it hadn't been in print in English. And so finally, when it came out in print in English, people were so shocked. People were so terribly shocked. And what shocked them also was that some of the ritual in this Freemasonic order that Rudolf Steiner and Marie Steiner created had actually been used in other settings, in other rituals that they had done. And this is quite common. You can find what's called the tableau, which is found in the first class of the High School of Spiritual Science, can also be found being used in Camp Hill communities and other places. So Rudolf Steiner did not exclusively arrive at all of his tremendously brilliant insight without knowing the lay of the land, without knowing what already existed in those traditions. So when he created his own Freemasonic group, which was supposed to be the second class of the High School of Spiritual Science, it was in fact only used for a short period of time. But when this came out on the internet, I got into a big debate with people and said, look, Steiner's Freemasonry is already implicit in all these areas. And so I gathered together the quotations that were so similar to things that I had seen in Freemasonry, and I put them together and sent them out. And then I got contacted from people in Europe saying, how could you have released these secret papers of Steiner's? And I said, no, I haven't seen the secret papers of Steiner. But if I were Steiner, I would use these rituals and these words in this way. And by golly, they said, in fact, you have nailed that one on the head. That is exactly the very ritual which we still do to this very day. There are some anthroposophists still stuck on Steiner's Freemasonic work. There are some anthroposophists still stuck on his theosophical work. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because in Theosophy, the references to Eastern thinking, whether it be Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, all these different paths, Zarathustra and Zendavesta, all these different things were already talked about by H.P. Blavatsky in her work, The Secret Doctrine, and Isis Unveiled, those two works specifically, but in many other books of hers. And I personally have read all of the things that I've seen available ever in English by Blavatsky, because they were the foundation upon which Steiner started giving his lectures. And he used a lot of their terms, and their terms, in fact, come from the East. So whether it be Freemasonry or whether it be Buddhism and Hinduism, Rudolf Steiner did not shy away from understanding the historic lineage paths that had already created what he then gave out in Knowledge of Higher Worlds. Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and its attainment is, in fact, a path to enlightenment. It says right in the book. It's a very clear path to enlightenment. And when it tells you, which I did in this article, and that's what this talk is all about, is to elucidate an article, which can be found in the notes below this podcast. What I tried to point out was that if you codify what Rudolf Steiner says in Knowledge of Higher Worlds and you literally make the lists of exactly particularly the moral characteristics you have to develop, or the inner soul attitude that you have to have, or the preliminaries that you must go through before you even approach the concept of knowledge of higher worlds and its attainment. In other words, enlightenment, realization, liberation. When you look at these and you codify them, they look so much like what I have done, which is a practice for many years. I don't even know how many years, called the Lamrim. It's a Tibetan Buddhist practice. And, people would condemn me because I'd be associated with Buddhism and Anthroposophy at the same time. But I'm going to explain today why that is, in fact, the hand in the glove. It's one and the same. It's basically two sides of the same coin. Now, Rudolf Steiner pointed out that as you're in knowledge of higher worlds, that first you must know some of the very basic things that would be found in Buddhism as given by Sakyamuni Gautama Buddha, the last Buddha who ascended underneath the abo tree, a fig tree, in approximately 583 BC, and gave out the teachings that the Sermon of Benares and many other teachings until his death, and he died pretty old age, and he gave many, many teachings, and these have been passed down by a word of mouth tradition, which we can still, we are told that these are the words of the Buddha. Now, one might say, what does that have to do with Rudolf Steiner? Well, let me first put this in perspective. When it came to Theosophy, when questions about Christianity were asked, the Theosophists would defer the questions to Dr. Steiner and to Anna Kingsford. Anna Kingsford was a brilliant Theosophist and a seer, and just a brilliant, brilliant person. Wrote a few books, and knew Blavatsky, knew all the top Theosophists, and she worked with Edward Maitland, and they put out some of the best things that could be considered Theosophical Christianity. Well, Rudolf Steiner and Anna Kingsford were the experts in Christianity, and eventually Rudolf Steiner broke away from the Theosophical Society because he did not really believe in the Theosophical teachings that as given by Blavatsky and A.P. Sinnott and Judge and Alcott, as if they were coming from the East, from ascended masters, or in Blavatsky's words, her doctrine, which comes from the stanzas of Dazan, and really you could say that her principal book on enlightenment is called The Voice of Silence. Both of the content of both of those books, the stanzas of Dazan and the phrases from the Golden Book of Precepts, which Blavatsky said she got these from, also called the Books of QT, but really they are the Mahayana tradition of the Heart Sutra in relationship to what we would now see as the Kala Chakra initiation, or the Kala Chakra Tantric initiation. So Blavatsky supposedly said she went to the East and she got this stuff directly from Tibetan Buddhism, particularly from Shigatse Monastery from the Panchen Lama. Now, this is not true. She never traveled to Tibet. But in 1889, and also earlier in the early 1700s, there were works of translations by Italians and Germans, and also in English, of the Kala Chakra Tantra, or the Tantras that came from the deepest teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. Teachings that go all the way back to even before Tibetan Buddhism, called Bonpo. And when you look at these teachings, you can break them down into the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. But Blavatsky said that she literally got these sacred teachings, which she then built her other works upon, particularly the Secret Doctrine, directly from the Panchen Lama. Well, the Panchen Lama is the number one teacher for the Dalai Lama in the Gelug tradition, Gelugpa. And so the Panchen Lama is the senior tutor for the Dalai Lama. Now, the Dalai Lama is one school of thought, in Tibetan Buddhism, but there are 4 schools, and now there's been a 5th school added. The 5th school is Bon, or Bonpo, and the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, basically said that it needs to be recognized that Bonpo was primary. It was original. It was before the other 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So if you really want the oldest of the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism or Buddhism, it goes back beyond Sakyamuni Gautama Buddha. It goes to a different Buddha, a Buddha who goes all the way back to 10,000 BC, and his name is Tampa Shenra Rinpoche. And he worked with 2 other Buddhas so that they would be the threefold manifestation of the higher spiritual bodies of the Buddha. And later, many years later, in about 900 AD, another Buddha, Tapasitra, became also a Buddha who gave the same transmission. So the transmissions that I'm talking about are the most ancient of transmissions on how to do mental development that will help you in your spiritual development reach enlightenment or reach liberation. But the big question would be, would Steiner's knowledge of higher worlds and his systematic path to enlightenment be the same or similar to that which has arisen out of Mahayana Buddhism and the teachings of Sakyamuni Buddha? Well, they are very, very similar. What I did in the article was I took a list that you have to go through when you're doing what's called the Lam Rin 7 limb practice, which is the Mahayana Heart Sutra practice of the Galupa tradition, which is the tradition of the Dalai Lama, to get you to enlightenment the fastest way that you can. It incorporates Sutrayana, in other words, morality training, Mantrayana, which is using mantras and mandalas for visualizations and evocations with your voice. It also then includes Vajrayana, using spiritual tools and deity worship to actually advance that movement towards enlightenment. And then Tantrayana, which so many people in the West, and by the way, most Westerners can't understand much at all about Buddhism. They can go to Vipassana classes, they can go to all these Buddhist classes and study all they want, but ask them a few basic questions and they will stumble over the fact that they really don't know the basic core of what Buddhism is trying to teach. And that's what I'd like to share a little bit with you today so that you can understand how that connects to Anthroposophy. But Rudolf Steiner pointed out in the Occultism in the 19th Century, in that lecture series, that Blavatsky was imprisoned by a brotherhood of Eastern occult dark brothers, a brotherhood that put her into what was called occult imprisonment, so that she couldn't break out of the ancient teachings of the past, of the East, and break into the direct perception, clairvoyant perception of what's going on in the spiritual world right now, which is directly related, of course, to Christ and Christ's appearance in the etheric realm, and the way that through the astral realm we can see a vision of Christ in the etheric as Christ is now performing the 5th deed of the great solar logos, which is to redeem the etheric body of the earth and at the same time the etheric body of human beings. The physical body of the earth has been redeemed during the mystery of Golgotha, but now we have to have the etheric body redeemed. So, I studied Tibetan Buddhism and have for a long time, for decades now. And I studied with the person who they say is the speech manifestation of the Panchen Lama, who is one of the Dalai Lama's best friends. He's his teacher. And so Gelek Rinpoche was my guru, but I'm a Christian through and through. And I have a higher degree in comparative religions, which was my first love in my whole life. I wanted to see why all the most beautiful things and the most beautiful words were all written about the divine, about God, about religions. So I have multiple degrees in religious formation as well as philosophy and comparative religions. So I've studied these things, and somebody has been asking my dear friend Michael McKibben, what is all this junk behind Doug's head when he's giving a talk? Well, those things remind me of the different paths that I've studied. But the path that I study isn't necessarily the path that I believe. I'm a Christian through and through. Matter of fact, it used to be a joke when they would find out that I was into so many different things, including Freemasonry, Sufism, Buddhism, Hinduism, you name it, Zoroastrianism, anything, any religion. I'm into all of them. That the joke was that when they would say, well, what belief do you have? I would say, well, I'm a Christian anthroposophist. And that was a joke, of course, but it indicates the fact that you need a synthesis of all the wisdom of the past merged with Christianity and then merged with the direct perception of Christ in our time. Because without that, you cannot have valid clairvoyance. And Tibetan Buddhism in the path to enlightenment or liberation, those paths, as well as following knowledge of higher worlds, open up your clairvoyant capacities. And once you have clairvoyant capacities, then once you turn them on the astral world, the etheric world, the physical world, you will see the being of the solar logos who incarnated once and only once, the Christ being who incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth for 3 1/3 years. You'll see that that being is still working actively now. So in the old days, and I've studied with many, many different Tibetan teachers, almost all the schools except for Bonpo. It's hard to find a Bonpo teacher. And so I studied that on my own. But I've studied with these teachers, and I always ask them in a private session with them, where is the second coming of Christ? Where is the etheric nature of Christ? Where is Christ right now? And in almost all cases, they will immediately say that they don't believe in that. But then they'll tell you about a being like Avalokiteshvara or Chinrezig or Vajrayogini or Brahman or Vishuvajra or Ishvara or 100 other names in all these different religions. And who are those beings? They're beings who are actively working right now in the etheric realm through the power of love to redeem human beings who are going through a crucifixion of materialism right now. So they will tell you, these clairvoyant Tibetan Buddhists, or these Vedic astrologers, or these people who are clairvoyant because they've done these practices, they will tell you that that being exists, but that they have a little bit different name for it. But that isn't their lineage. It's not their tradition. It's not their teachings. It's not what they believe. For instance, the being Avalokiteshvara, who probably is the most similar in Buddhism to Christ. Also, that being is called Chinrezig and has many other names. So many names you can't believe it. So many names. You could line up 100 statues and they would all be that god, which is really a goddess. Avalokiteshvara, the being of pure love and compassion. So these beings do exist. For instance, let's just take that being. That being Avalokiteshvara was a human being who all of a sudden looked out on the world and saw the suffering of the world. And it was so profound that his head split open and 11 other heads popped up out of his head, standing on top of his head, so that he could look in all directions and see all the suffering of all the sentient beings all at once. Then, as the compassionate response to that, sprouted 1,000 arms and hands, and in each of the palms of the hands is an eye that can see the specific need of the individual that Avalokiteshvara, this being, is going to help with their problem. And so in these 1,000 hands, 1,000 arms of the 1,000 hands, are also all the spiritual weapons, whether it be a mala, a damaru, a taiguk, a bow and arrow, whatever. It doesn't matter. There's many, many, many spiritual vajra tools. They are in the hands of Avalokiteshvara to be used to help stop the suffering of all sentient beings. So here's Avalokiteshvara says, I not only take the what's called the Bodhichitta vow, or the vow of the Bodhisattva, and that is done by developing Bodhichitta, which is from now until enlightenment, I and all sentient beings go to enlightenment. For the sake of all sentient beings, I will practice these deep yogas or these deep teachings. So that is said at the beginning of every one of these practices. Well, that's the same thing that Rudolf Steiner describes as the reverence, the awe, the wonder, the devotion, the respect, all of these things that must be the preliminary state of your heart before you start a spiritual practice. So Blavatsky was imprisoned and couldn't teach about the Christ. So she mentions Avalokiteshvara, she mentions these other Eastern versions of Christ, but she does not mention the active being of Christ in our time right now, because that proves the mettle of any clairvoyant. If you don't know that, then you obviously don't know how to see past the astral light into the etheric and to see what is going on there in terms of the spiritual world. Now, the Tibetan Buddhists and the Buddhists will say, oh, well, that's okay. We have the same thing going on. We have the being Manjushri, let's say, for example, or Avalokiteshvara, or the being of Tara and the many colors of the female Tara, or many 10,000 Buddhas, or the vajrayogini. We could talk about vajrayogini all day long. So they have these beings who highly developed spiritual Buddhist teachers supposedly went into the spiritual world, into the realm of nirvana, or what's called nirmanakaya. Rudolf Steiner calls it spirit self. It's also called in Hindu manas. They went into this realm above the physical manifestation, and there they were able to directly encounter in what's called Tushita heaven, in the illusory world, the manifestations of Buddha, who has advanced beyond where Buddha was in 5803 BC, when Buddha died. Buddha actually has advanced since then. So Buddha was a bodhisattva in training for a long time before that, and then ascended and became the Buddha. But even since then, Buddha has now done even further work and come even further along. And we'll describe that in just a minute. But essentially, what Buddha gave at that time, Rudolf Steiner says, was all of the wisdom that needed to be given so that Christ could then come and bring that wisdom into his own body through love to give to the earth and to all human beings. So Steiner says that Buddha came to teach about compassion and love, but that Christ was compassion and love. That Buddha came to teach all beings how to get out of the wheel of samsara, in other words, reincarnating again and again into suffering, whereas Christ became the wheel of karma, the wheel of karma. Christ is now the Lord of karma. So what Buddha was doing was very good at the time, but at that time Christ had yet to incarnate, except in these pre-earthly deeds of Christ, which, by the way, because Buddha, during the time that Buddha was a bodhisattva, would have known what was going on in the spiritual world at that time. He would have known that Christ was making pre-earthly deeds on the earth. Now, these are very ancient, two of them back to the time of, there were 3 gardens of Eden, 2 or 3 gardens of Eden, depending upon the way you want to cut the pie. And in 3 incarnations, which didn't come all the way into the physical, Christ came down and helped human beings during Lemurian Atlantis learn to stand upright, speak, and think. These are the 3 pre-earthly deeds of Christ. Well, during that time, Christ was manifesting through a being called Adam Kadmon in different bodies, angelic bodies, and that those gifts of that being were active spiritual manifestations that the Bodhisattva, Buddha, later called Gautama Buddha or Sakyamuni Buddha, he knew these things at that time. So in fact, Rudolf Steiner makes the cryptic remark, and some of the things Steiner says are so shocking that I really recommend that you read this article that I put together, because the selections from Rudolf Steiner are unbelievable to hear them out of somebody else's mouth until you see that how Rudolf Steiner says them, and that he clearly does say these things. Rudolf Steiner says that Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, was the first Christian. What does he mean by that? What he means is that during the time of Atlantis, or even before that, and during the time of Lemuria, human beings couldn't really handle the overwhelming physicality that was happening on the earth. So many of these souls stayed out on the planets instead of coming to Earth. So they actually lived their experience of what the earth was going through during Lemuria from a planet. Well, there are beings still on those planets, and there are beings who are in those spheres of those planets who are in between death and rebirth, or coming from the sun at midnight, the rings of Saturn, coming back to the earth to incarnate. And so in these realms, you actually have the manifestations of parts of the Buddha that is teaching from the spiritual world, just as Christ is still teaching from the spiritual world, from the etheric realm, which is called the Buddhi, or life spirit, or Sambhogakaya, or Parinirvana. So there's Nirvana, Parinirvana, Mahaparinirvana. So there are these three spiritual realms. Well, Buddha, when he was helping human beings basically manifest on the earth through the planets, it was Christ who sent Buddha to the planet Mercury. Now, that actually means the planet Venus, what's called occult Venus, but we'll just leave it at that, that he was sent to Mercury. And later, after Buddha ascended incarnated and ascended underneath the Bodhi tree, or the Bo tree, the fig tree, when that happens, a Bodhisattva no longer incarnates again because they become a Buddha. Well, at that time, Christ still hadn't incarnated. But Christ thereafter sent Buddha to the realm of Mars to basically bring that peaceful attitude of Buddhism into the warring realm of Mars. And there he works to this day with St. Francis of Assisi, according to Rudolf Steiner. So one can say Steiner literally said that Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, was the first Christian, and that he literally helped Christianity and later worked with St. Francis and other Christians to continue to teach the aspect of love and compassion that is the basis of Christianity. Now, you might think that's completely crazy, but it gets even wilder than that. According to Rudolf Steiner, Buddha, who was in the spiritual realm at the time that Christ incarnated, literally came down, hovered over that pure soul, Jesus of Nazareth, before the Christ embodied Jesus of Nazareth at age 30. So when Jesus was born, Jesus of Nazareth, Buddha was there as that angel, these angelic voices that were singing hallelujah in praise to this being, because the Buddha was in the spiritual world. The Buddha could see what was happening. Of course, the Buddha is going to participate in the most important event in all of human spiritual development, the incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth in Christ. So Buddha came back and gave up his Nirmanakaya, his transformed astral body, to be the star that the Magi followed, and to be the angelic presence around that pure soul that Rudolf Steiner calls the Nathan soul, or that in Hebrew philosophy and esotericism is called Adam Kadmon. So Buddha not only is directly Christian and works with Christ even before Christ came into a body in Jesus of Nazareth, but also continues to work with Christ afterwards. As a matter of fact, the next Buddha that's coming, one of the things that Sakyamuni Buddha did was he taught quite a bit about what will happen with the next Buddha, whose name is Maitreya Buddha. But that being, who's a bodhisattva right now, you can't really call him the Maitreya Buddha yet, or she, because that won't happen for 3,000 years. But in 3,000 years from now, another Buddha will ascend and basically follow the path that so many Buddhas, and people don't know this, but there have been many, many Buddhas. But the one that we focus on is Sakyamuni Buddha, because he was the reformer who took ancient Hinduism and basically took it out of the caste system and allowed anyone through meditation and through this type of Lam Rin practice, this type of enlightenment practice, also called Lo Jiang, also called um, uh, uh, Dzogchen, and it's also called Nayan Rigud Siddhi. It's got many, many names, but this path to enlightenment is what it's about. And that is why I studied comparative religions, to find the common path in all of them. But the reason that I continue to study Buddhism is because it so much links up with not just the Eastern teachings of Theosophy, but also with the clearest, most illuminated path to enlightenment, which, in my opinion, if you look at what Rudolf Steiner has done with knowledge of higher worlds and its attainment, which at one point people have literally said was a rewriting, a reconstitution of the Lam Rin practice. And I believe that that is to a degree true. I don't know that Rudolf Steiner saw these translations about the Kala Chakra and about Lam Rin, but it doesn't really matter. Because if you're speaking the truth, it's the truth no matter where you are. And that's the reason truth is ubiquitous and appears in all traditional religions. And all you have to do is look closely and see that it may be a different image, a different coloring, a different flavor, but it's the same wisdom substance. And so I do not believe for one moment that Rudolf Steiner needed to take ancient Freemasonry and rewrite it per se, or to take ancient Lam Rin practice or ancient Tibetan Buddhist practice or Hindu practices and rewrite them for the modern time. He gave us a 33-step path that you can take without any teacher, without any guru. It's basically a reconstituting of the ancient mysteries, but removing the fact that they were mysteries and had to be taught by an initiate to an aspirant. That is no longer the case. The case now is that we could, if we wanted, and I have, gone into the ancient Tibetan teachings and find the same exact content and work on it, and you will retain the same results. So I can suggest to you that after doing the Lam Rin practice, and Lam Rin, just the first retreat requires doing this meditation 100,000 times. It's a very complicated meditation, matter of fact, and just it took weeks of doing nothing but this to attain the 100,000 completions of this meditative cycle. But it is the same exact results that are going to arise out of what Rudolf Steiner gives in knowledge of higher worlds and his attainment. Now, I say that, but there is one exception, and that's that Rudolf Steiner has given us the greatest Christology that anyone who's ever studied Christ or Christianity has ever given. And so when you add all of that content of spiritual science and the Christological aspects of it, it goes far, far, far beyond Tibetan Buddhism. But you will find that these elements are shared back and forth over time to such a degree that if you, for instance, got my wife's book, The Gospel of Sophia, I believe it is in the second volume. There's a 3-volume. It's a trilogy called Gospel of Sophia. You can find that for free in PDFs on our site, ourspirit.com, or you can get it from Amazon. But the point is that in there is a description of vajrayogini. Vajrayogini is in all 4 Tibetan schools, and she is the highest yoga tantric guru. She's female, and she is the consort of all 10,000 Buddhas that live in the spiritual world. So one female consort is the wisdom teacher and the wisdom catalyst for all Buddhas who have ascended. Now, if you look at her, she has, in the ritualistic practices, has so many similarities to Christianity and to the Eucharist that one has to ask who borrowed it from whom. Because here you have Vajrayogini. She's stripped naked. She has a crown around her head, a cross over her shoulder. She's drinking from a chalice that has her blood in it. She's holding a curved knife that she offered up her body through sacrifice for the sake of all sentient beings. She's broken the neck of pride and is standing upon the strength of compassion and love. She is dancing in transcendental wisdom, and she's looking to her um, divine nature, her other part of her divine nature, looking up into the heavens. All of these things describe Jesus of Nazareth's passion and way of the cross. And it goes on and on. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of similarities. The same thing is true if you codify knowledge of higher worlds and you look at the Lamrim or the Lojong or Dzogchen or any of these practices that have been codified and put into a very what they would call a simple system, though it is anything but simple. Same thing with Rudolf Steiner. When you read Knowledge of Higher Worlds and then you look at the way that I've codified it and put it into notes so they could basically be used as prompts for when you're meditating to say, okay, do I have these prerequisites all done in my mind? Have I prepared my soul this way? Have I done this? Have I done that? Okay, now I'm going to meditate on this. I'm going to meditate in this way. And as Rudolf Steiner describes in Knowledge of Higher Worlds, this path of initiation is ancient and has been prepared by teachers since time immemorial. Now, the thing that is important to remember is it changes depending upon your time. An initiation in the time of Buddha can't even be compared to an initiation in today's world, or an initiation of Hermes in ancient Egypt, or an initiation of even the Greeks at Ephesus, or the Greeks at Eleusis, or any of the mystery schools. We can't even begin to put our consciousness into their consciousness to understand what that was like. Therefore, we have to have new translators, new commentators, new prophets, and people who have a new revelation. And that's what Rudolf Steiner had. He had a new revelation of the ways to get to these things, because if you just take the Lamrim practice, yes, you'll find it very beautifully codified and described in modern terms and from the point of view of the aspirant, so that you don't get confused in Knowledge of Higher Worlds. But then if you go to stages of knowledge, or you go to occult science or study of man or any of his other books, it goes so much further than that. There is no comparison between the psychology and physiology wisdom found in Rudolf Steiner's book, The Study of Man, compared to the entire teachings of, let's say, Karma Kagyu Dzogchen. It's the same content, but the old version isn't really going to help you that much unless you can translate it and then live with a translation that makes it applicable to this world now. But if you take what Rudolf Steiner says, you don't need the old version, because the old version, first off, has to be updated with Christianity. Secondly, it has to be updated with everything that has happened with supposedly the people who gave you this wisdom. Let's call it Buddha. Let's call it Buddha manifesting from the etheric realm as Manjushri, the being of wisdom, or the being of compassion, vajrayogini, or any one of the many Buddhas who actually only have etheric form, which are manifestations, further manifestations of the teachings of Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha. But there are many, many Buddhas. So you should be able to go into the spiritual world and attain exactly what Rudolf Steiner said, which is the ability to start to see chakras, to see aura. If you start to do your spiritual practice the way he gives it to you, reviewing your day backwards in order, it develops certain capacities. Pretty soon you're able to literally sense, as something is happening, what the karmic outcome will be. In other words, you know the future as it's happening in the present. Well, in Dzogchen or Lamrim, they'll describe it as the sounds, the lights, the sounds, and the rays. So the lights, the sound, and the rays, the lights are imagination. That's Rudolf Steiner's spiritual self. The sounds are the life spirit. That's inspiration, what Rudolf Steiner calls inspiration. And the rays are the intuitions. Those are things that come into physical manifestation as a ray from the spiritual world, manifesting through an aspirant into the physical world. So you're talking about the same exact things, but if you call the lights, the sounds, and the rays Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dharmakaya, you're going to lose Westerners. So Rudolf Steiner took all of that, and even though Annie Besant continued this tradition of H.P. Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society to use a lot of Eastern terms and basically obscure things by Eastern terms, unfortunately, instead of elucidating them in a way that could be for a Christian Western esotericist. And so Rudolf Steiner pointed out that with Theosophy, that A.P. Sinnett and his esoteric Buddhism went the opposite direction than the reality is, or that Rama Prasad's Nature's Finer Forces took the tattvas and went the wrong direction. So many of these people who are theosophists believe that they understand esoteric Buddhism, esoteric Hinduism, and teachings from the East, but they do not. And that's the reason they devolved into the cheap shot of saying that if you do it their way, and so many of these people from Spalding to Mark Prophet to Elizabeth Clare Prophet to Godfrey Ray King to whatever, they all tell you the same thing. If you do it my way, then eventually the master, a master, is going to show up. Master Kutumi, Master Dwal Kul, Master Seraphis Bey, Master Hilarion, all these masters. Well, that is completely unnecessary because the only master you need is yourself. Your higher self is your master. It's just that we don't know how to communicate in that spiritual language yet. Plus, we have so many people who want to help midwife our birth into the spiritual world, from Anthroposophia to the Cosmic Sophia to the Mother Sophia to the Archangel Michael, the regent of our times, who's now an archai, to Vidar, the archangel of who has taken his place, to all the archangels, to the communion of saints, to the hierarchy, the angelic host. We have so many people ready to help us. We don't need it anymore. The veil between the physical and the spiritual world is so thin now that any effort whatsoever will raise a red flag to the spiritual world, and you will receive help. And so that is the reason that Tyla and myself put together the Gospel of Sophia, because it is a modern path of initiation, which isn't locked into one spiritual language or the next. It gives you an example of a dozen different spiritual languages and then says, find your own. This is how you find the 22 languages of your spiritual language that is appropriate for you to communicate with the spiritual world and the spiritual beings that you have risen up to meet. That's the trick. Whether it be knowledge of higher worlds, the Lam Rin, the Lojang, Dzogchen, the golden moment of illumination of Zen, it doesn't really matter. You choose your path, and if you have a pure heart and you stay in a state of reverence and devotion and awe and wonder, and you're pure, that's all you need. Patanjali had 125 things you were supposed to do on this path, on his path. And then the 126th was, you can forget the first 125 and just be pure. And that's the truth of the matter. So though I must admit, I have spent countless hours studying Buddhism, and I never wanted to study Buddhism, by the way, because I'm a Christian. And I didn't understand how powerful the training, the mental training and the moral training of Buddhism and Hinduism, or even Freemasonry, or any path that states that they're going to help you develop your moral self through virtues. Who would have known that these paths are so powerful, and yet really they're very, very quick? For instance, the path of purity, that's Dzogchen. It's called the Great Perfection. All you have to do in this path, and it's a secret path inside of the Kaju tradition called the Karma Kaju tradition, and the Karmapa is like the Dalai Lama of that tradition. And it goes all the way back to Bonpo and to Tampa Shinrab Miwoche. And what it says is, It doesn't take any effort at all to reach enlightenment. You simply have to realize that you're there. Well, the ancient Upanishads said the same thing. They said there are two things. There's inside of the human being the Atman, and outside of the human being the Brahman. Brahman is all created things. Atman is you, your individuality, your I am. And they are the same. They are one and the same. Well, that's the same thing with Dzogchen Great Perfection. All of a sudden, you realize that you are all space and that it's completely empty, except that it is so perfectly clear because it is basically where light is born. So you create emptiness through this Rigpa, it's called, or Niyam, Ragad Yud CD. It's very strange names to have to memorize these monosyllabic phrases. But basically, once you have that, you realize that it's as simple as understanding that when you are an empty vessel, when you are the Holy Grail, when your heart is empty, completely empty, it is the cosmos. It's the entire cosmos. It is a 3D holographic, exact replica of the cosmos. And that into it streams light. And that light is thought. And that in the light, there are higher archetypal thoughts that then create the wisdom that manifest everything that we know in the physical world. In other words, the entire cosmos is thought. You are a maker of thought. You are a thinker. And when you can empty yourself so that it is not your personal thought about your own desires and your own needs and habits and your own wants and intents and all these kind of things, these lower things, when your heart is open and it's empty, wisdom will rush in. And when wisdom rushes in, there's only one thing to do. That's love. Because if you truly had wonder and awe and respect and reverence for the world and you looked out upon the world, you would be completely dumbfounded at the wisdom that is found in every single tiny speck of anything in the known manifest world. And they're all miracles. And for instance, an atom is mostly space. So no matter what, you can pick up a brick, it's mostly space. So when you understand that all of space is you, and that your heart can hold other thoughts much bigger than your thoughts, and that these thoughts, these moral imaginations, this moral thinking can then lead you to moral inspiration. In other words, the light can lead you to sound, can then lead you to deeds, and those deeds are free deeds of love done out of courage. Then you realize that all the effort to get to enlightenment can simply be abnegated in a moment, like when Jakob Burma looked through the window and saw the light shining off of a pewter bowl, and it went into his eye, and he was illuminated. And after that, he could speak multiple languages he never knew before, and he had the wisdom of the sages, the wisdom of all time. So when Rudolf Steiner comes up with this wisdom, he did it because of his own moment of enlightenment. He did it because he was enlightened, and he did it because out of compassion, he wanted to teach everyone how to attain the same thing. And it is, of course, through love. So he's not a copycat, okay? And so when people say, oh, he stole this from that, he stole that from this and that, no one has a comprehensive cosmology like Rudolf Steiner. He has the most complete because it's the most up to date. There are very complete cosmologies from the past. The Hindu cosmology with 300 different deities in their pantheon is astounding. And we have yet to understand, say, the wisdom of the hieroglyphs of the Egyptians. We've yet to understand the Akkadians. We've yet to understand so many cosmologies from the past. But if it is not updated, if it is not apropos to our time, then it is not the one that is necessary. And you will be given that one, because that is a online, interactive, initiation of enlightenment that is provided specifically for you by the spiritual world, and particularly by the beings that help you across the threshold, whether it's the threshold between the physical world and the spiritual world, which can happen either during meditation, during sleep and dreams, or when you die. It's the same world you go to. So if you practice now and you learn how to live in a world where there are no physical elements to it, where you are not brain bound, you're not earth bound, but you can then live in a world of archetypal realities that tend to be more eternal and more permanent. Those are the things that will reach the stage of enlightenment for you. Now, Dzogchen says that they have an active path of 24 masters who go all the way back, and every one of these masters attained the rainbow body at death. So they actually didn't die. They were translated into heaven, and no physical remains were left, just their robes sitting there on the dais. This happened to 24 of these masters in a row. And these manifestations of the rainbow body, there's all these different things that appear, these signs and so on and so forth. Other people who were training to be clairvoyant could see this. So this is not a path of imagination. This is not some doctrine, ecclesiastical doctrine or dogma of a church given out by a bunch of men wearing women's dresses, to be quite frank with you, which is what happens. The men supplanted the females in the religions, who were then the oracles at that time to the spiritual world. That's all past. We don't need any of that. Now we are a religion of one. We must find our own North Star to guide our own spiritual development. And we must find a new, these all were secret before. They were all mysteries. There's no more mysteries. There's no more secrets. You can look up every single initiation that I've ever had, and that's a whole lot of them, you can now find online. So there's no hiding this anymore. The only reality is are you going to take it and do something with it so that you have the signs and you start to show the signs of liberation, of enlightenment? And these things are spelled out in Knowledge of Higher Worlds. They're spelled out in Lam Rin. They're spelled out in all these different paths. But the question is, can you yourself take control of your own self-initiation at this point? And whether it's through Steiner or Buddhism or Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, it doesn't matter. You find your own path, you find your own language, the 22 letters, and then that language will give you the chance to commune with the spiritual world. And that's really what I wanted to try to communicate, is that there are so many paths. And if you look closely, you'll find a golden thread that runs through all of them. That is the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have others do unto you. But no matter how deep you want to go with the wisdom that you're trying to glean from life, you'll find that in the traditional religions, they all distill it down to the same exact substances. And in general, it's called Sophia. It's called wisdom, Shekinah, Ishtar, Isis. It's called philosophia. In other words, I love Sophia, wisdom. Sophia is wisdom. So it's all the same path. It's just that you may choose to use one language or another because it gives you the images that you may relate to more easily. So when it comes down to it, if someone asks you, was knowledge of the higher worlds derived from Tibetan Buddhism teachings? You can say, not necessarily, but they are the same content, because we don't know that Rudolf Steiner ever saw any of the teachings out of the East. We don't know that. They aren't in his libraries that I have seen. So whether he derived them directly from clairvoyant experience or not doesn't really matter. He built on a tradition that has been going on since the time that we picked the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And during this time, as the Buddha has been leading the bodhisattvas, the circle of 12 bodhisattvas around Christ, because Christ has been the teacher of the bodhisattvas all this time, since 3100 BC up until 1900, we were in the Dark Ages. And during that time, the Bodhisattva, who became the Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, was working with Manis and Scythianus and Zarathustra and all of these different beings with Christ in the middle as their inspiration. So one can actually say there is no such thing as Anthroposophy without Buddhism, and there is no such thing as Buddhism without Christianity.